Hi guys. What I want to look at right now is, and what we talked about in our previous summary is kind of the impact of what I see as in many ways the most important days of the Civil War, early July of 1863, where you have the culmination of the Battle of Vicksburg um, in Mississippi along the Mississippi River, kind of giving the North um, kind of the keys to the Mississippi and control of that thoroughfare of the South. And then the Battle of Gettysburg. And Gettysburg to this day, which is still the largest battle ever fought on American soil because of us basically living with two moats on either side of us, the Atlantic and the Pacific. The ravages of war that Europe has had to deal with for 1,000+ years, and things that have happened in Asia don't happen to us. We are somewhat cut off from the rest of the world. And so still to this day, a battle in 1863, Gettysburg, is the largest battle ever fought. But what you have with July of 1863 is a transition in momentum from, and I wouldn't say the South controlling the Civil War, but the South being very successful at the time of the Civil War, and then that transitions to the North after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So let's break that down and see how that comes about. And we'll start with Vicksburg. And like I said, it's a strategic city on the Mississippi River, and it's almost like a fortress because Vicksburg is at this big turn in the Mississippi. So if Union gunboats ever wanted to go here, they have to make a really slow turn, okay, to do that. And so Vicksburg kind of becomes a choke point, a cutoff point, okay. But if the Union can get control of the Mississippi River, they can push on to New Orleans. They can cut off any trade of the South. So obviously, you see the importance of Vicksburg. Okay, and so what you see is Ulysses S. Grant, and this is part of the advent of Grant as well, where Grant continues to place his stamp on the war and eventually becomes the overall commander of U.S. forces, Union forces during the Civil War. Um, Grant's willingness to do whatever necessary to win the battle, and Vicksburg's a perfect and sometimes brutal example of that because it becomes almost old school medieval style siege warfare where they cut off the city. Within that city is a significant number of civilians. Okay, so and Grant does just that. He uses his resources and surrounds and from May through July of 1863, he just cuts off Vicksburg. And the commander at Vicksburg kind of has to make a decision about, hey, what am I going to do? I have these civilians here. I have women and children. There's no more food coming in. And eventually, Vicksburg and the Confederates in Vicksburg see their situation appropriately so as, it's not tenable, and they surrender. And so the South is cut in half. We now the Union controls the far western theater of the Civil War, that region of Mississippi and up the Mississippi River. Okay, the South loses its primary transportation source, and big picture, um, the North embraces the concept of total war, whatever it takes to win the war. If we have to wage the war and civilians are hurt, so be it. And Grant is willing to do that. Lincoln is willing to do that. I think it's easy for us historically to, I think we always want to paint this angelic picture of Lincoln. Lincoln wanted to win the war, and with any means necessary. Lincoln's thesis was the sooner I can end the war, that would actually save lives, and I can begin the process of rebuilding the Union of the United States. And so it is it is Grant, and to some extent his lieutenant Sherman, who now come to the forefront of the Union and their willingness to embrace total war. Now, why this is going on, so simultaneously, while Vicksburg is finishing up in Mississippi, you have in Pennsylvania the Battle of Gettysburg. the largest battle ever fought on U.S. soil. And you have a large number of troops, estimated 90,000 U.S. troops, and the Confederates have a strong number. They're almost usually the Confederates. Lee's army was consistently outmanned by the Union, and this is one time where Lee was in the ballpark of having the same numbers. And Lee has been through 1862 through 1863. Lee's been successfully um, just rampaging Union troops. I mean, Lincoln can't find a general. Lincoln's having to change generals all the time. Some generals will fight, some aren't. The ones that do fight aren't very good tacticians. Um, Lee is inflicting great casualties on U.S. forces. And using this, Lee invades the North. He kind of sweeps around Union troops and actually gets, and it's kind of interesting, the Southern Army gets north of the Northern Army and threatens, and this is interesting, those of you that are from that part of the country, it's not that far from Gettysburg to Washington, D.C. And so Lee hopes to be able to force a movement on Washington, D.C., where the Union would have to potentially sue for peace. At the very least, you create great psychological damage. Hey, wait a minute, if the South can run around and invade northern states, are we safe? Should we keep fighting this war? You know, psychologically, you can disgrace Lincoln during an election year. And the hope was that eventually the North would sue for peace. And then you would end up having two. You would have had the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. So these are the wages. These are the stakes of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee knew he had troops. He felt like he had the Union somewhat on their heels a little bit. So he's very, very aggressive and pushes. And if not for of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, if not for some um, pretty substantial Union, chivalry in stopping a Confederate advance, I think the day Gettysburg would have gone much differently, and in theory, the war would have gone much differently. When it's all said and done, at the end of the first couple of days of battle, though, you'd call it a stalemate, but the North holds most of the high ground around the major battlefield, so they're in a more defensible position. And it kind of has to, now the South has to force the action. They have to figure out what they're going to do. Um, this is Lee's great mistake, and I guess we all have them. Lee's generalship, especially generalship, Lee is one of the most studied generals in world history, and there's certain historians, and this is way beyond what my research I've done or anything like that, but put Lee on a scale of generalship with Napoleon and others. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. I do know that Lee, using a much smaller army, an army that wasn't as well equipped as the Union, put defeat after defeat after defeat on the Union Army. And so Lee's thesis is, coming into the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, is he has an equal number of men. He feels like he's got a winnable situation, and so he wants to do a frontal push into the main Union line at Gettysburg, and then make a forced march towards putting Washington, D.C. in jeopardy. Okay. It doesn't work. He asked too much of his men. I think it's bad tactics. They march roughly a mile across an open field. The Union was not as beat up as Lee had hoped, and they repulse this big attack. And this is probably as close as the South came to winning the Civil War. Had the South won at Gettysburg, we potentially have a very, very different American history. Okay, I don't know what would have happened, but there's the potential of having a very, very different American history. So, but it is interesting, and it does show the impact of, single events, and if we really break it down, you can look at even the actions of single individuals. But what ends up happening? One, you kind of have the high water mark for the South. This is it. After Gettysburg, the South and Lee are basically fighting a defensive war. He moves back to Virginia, sets up almost a World War I like trench system. Really, many of the things that Lee did in and around Richmond, Virginia, and some of the fighting did became examples to how World War I was fought. But the war is still prolonged. The Union commander, General George Meade, did not follow up and try to pursue Lee's army. He actually allows them to escape back to Virginia. He kind of had Lee bottled up, and had he acted a little more aggressively, maybe the war ends a year and a half earlier. And because of Vicksburg, and in many ways, I think because of the lack of aggressiveness with Union generals, Lee becomes the overall commander of U.S. forces and only answers to President Lincoln. And Lincoln gives Grant great leeway to prosecute the war. And Grant does so very viciously and very aggressively. And Grant grasped the numbers that we've talked about previously. There's just more men and stuff in the North, and I'm going to use those things to grind the South down. Grant I wouldn't call it losing battles, but there would be certain days in battles where Grant would lose maybe twice as many men as the Confederates were, but he would just keep coming. He knew he had the numbers. Okay, so you have this move forward. All right. So what I want to do next is we'll kind of get into the aftermath of the Civil War. We're kind of look at Appomattox, Sherman's march to the sea, and then what do you do? What does the Union do? How does President Lincoln rebuild the nation after the Civil War? Okay? Thanks, guys.